I never thought I'd see the day when my own husband would call me a burden. My name is Linda. I'm 63 years old, and until recently, I believed that the man I shared 40 years of my life with would stand by me in sickness and in health. That's what the vows said after all. But as I lay in a stark hospital room, machines beeping around me, I learned that promises mean little when love has already packed its bags and left. The illness came suddenly. One morning, I was in my garden, pruning the roses I'd tended for decades, and by the afternoon, I was in an ambulance struggling to breathe. Pneumonia, the doctor said, severe enough that I needed weeks of observation. I was frightened, weak. But what cut me deepest wasn't the tubes in my arms or the sterile white walls. It was the loneliness. At first, Richard came to see me every day. He'd bring newspapers and talk about the neighborhood gossip. But even then, I noticed something in his eyes, a flicker of impatience, a sigh when I asked him to adjust my blanket, the way he'd glance at his watch instead of at me. As the days turned into weeks, his visits grew shorter. Sometimes he wouldn't come at all, and the nurses would whisper, "Maybe he's just tired." But I knew better. One evening, he sat in the chair by my bed, arms crossed, face tight. I asked him if he could bring me some fresh clothes from home. He muttered under his breath, but I heard it clear as day. "God, you're such a burden." I felt my heart split in two. A burden after everything I'd given him. The meals cooked, the house kept, the nights I stayed awake nursing him through his own flu and bad back. 40 years of loyalty, and I had become nothing more than dead weight to him. My lips trembled, but I stayed silent. My body was already weak. My spirit couldn't afford another wound that night. The next morning, Richard barely looked at me. He dropped a bag of clothes on the chair and walked out without a kiss, without even a goodbye. I stared at the bag and thought, so this is what I've been reduced to, a responsibility he can't wait to dump. Nights in the hospital were the hardest. I'd press the call button less and less, afraid to annoy the nurses the way I seemed to annoy my husband. I'd watch the shadows of the machines dance on the walls, listening to the faint sounds of life beyond my window. Cars, footsteps, laughter. I wanted so badly to be home again, in my own bed, with my own quilt. Then came the moment that confirmed my worst fears. One night I couldn't sleep. The fourth in my arm itched, and the room was too quiet. I heard footsteps in the hallway, then Richard's voice, low but animated. I sat up, straining my ears. He was on the phone. His tone was soft, almost tender, the kind of voice he hadn't used with me in years. He chuckled, whispered something I couldn't quite catch, then said, "I can't wait until you're in the house. It feels so empty without you." My chest tightened. Empty without who? Certainly not without me. I was right there, lying in that hospital bed, clinging to the hope that my marriage still meant something. I pressed my pillow against my chest to muffle the sob that escaped me. When he walked back into my room, I quickly turned my face toward the window, pretending to be asleep. He sat down, scrolling through his phone, smiling faintly at whatever message popped up. He didn't notice the tears sliding down my cheek. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't care. That was the moment the seed of realization took root inside me. The man I thought was my anchor had already set sail for another shore. And I was left to drown in the waves of betrayal. Still, I told myself, hold on, Linda. Just hold on a little longer. You'll be home soon. The thought of my house, my sanctuary, was the only light in that endless darkness. I imagined sitting on my porch again, sipping tea, smelling the roses. That picture in my mind kept me alive when everything else seemed to be slipping away. But I had no idea that the home I longed for was no longer waiting for me, that while I was hooked up to IV drips fighting for my breath, someone else was already moving into the life I had built. I didn't know it yet, but the true betrayal hadn't even begun. The day the doctor told me I could finally go home, I felt like my heart had been given wings. After weeks of lying in that hospital bed, breathing recycled air, eating tasteless food, and counting the slow ticks of the clock, I was finally free. I imagined the warmth of my kitchen, the creak of the wooden floorboards I knew by heart, and the scent of lavender from the garden that drifted through the open windows. I thought Richard would be there to bring me home, but when I called, he said he was busy with errands. So I took a taxi. I tried not to let the disappointment sting too much. After all, I told myself, maybe he was preparing the house, making it comfortable for me again. Maybe he'd even surprise me. The cab pulled up to our street, and I felt a rush of familiarity. Those tall oak trees I'd walked under for decades, the fence Richard and I painted together one summer, the neighbors' yards glowing with late spring flowers. I held my purse tightly, smiling with anticipation. But as soon as the car stopped in front of my house, my joy faltered. The front door looked different. A new lock, shiny brass against the old wood. My brows furrowed. I told myself maybe Richard had changed it for security while I was away, but when I pulled out my key and tried it, it didn't fit. My heart began to pound. I rang the bell. For a moment, silence. Then the door swung open. There stood Richard, my husband of 40 years, but he wasn't alone. Draped around him was a woman nearly 20 years younger than me, with bright lipstick, perfectly styled hair, and, God help me, my robe on her shoulders. My robe, the same soft cotton robe my mother gave me for my 60th birthday. She clutched a glass of wine in her manicured hand, smirking at me like I was an unwanted guest. "Richard," I stammered, my voice trembling. What is going on? Why doesn't my key work?" He didn't flinch. He didn't look ashamed. He looked bored, like he'd been rehearsing this moment. "You don't live here anymore, Linda," he said coldly. "It's better this way." His words hit me like a slap. I gripped the door frame for balance. "What are you talking about? This is my home. Our home." The woman, Elaine, I would later learn, sipped her wine and leaned against the doorframe. "Richard and I have made it our home now. You shouldn't be stressing yourself over it, darling. Not in your condition." Her condescension burned worse than Richard's cruelty. I felt the neighbors' eyes from across the street. Curtains shifted. Silhouettes stood still. They were watching me. Linda, the woman who had tended that house for decades, now standing outside like a beggar. "Richard," I whispered, trying to steady my voice. "My things, my clothes, my life is inside that house." His face hardened. "You're sick, Linda. You can't take care of yourself, let alone a whole house. You should think about moving into assisted living. Elaine will help me manage things now." It was like my chest had collapsed. He wasn't just replacing me, he was erasing me. I felt a sob crawl up my throat, but I forced it back down. "That house," I said, my voice shaking but firm, "was left to me by my parents. It's mine. You don't have the right." Elaine laughed softly, swirling her wine. "Don't be dramatic. Richard says you've been confused lately." I stood frozen on the porch, my suitcase by my side, my heart breaking into shards so sharp I could barely breathe. Every memory I had made in that house, Christmas mornings, Sunday dinners, my children's laughter, flashed before my eyes, and now I was being pushed out like a stranger. Richard's hand tightened on the door. "You need to leave, Linda. Don't make a scene." A scene. As though I were some nuisance embarrassing him in front of the neighbors. I looked past him into the living room. My favorite quilt was on the couch. The family photo album lay open on the coffee table. But the picture of our wedding day was gone, replaced by a vase of roses Elaine probably bought. I staggered back a step, trembling. "You'll regret this, Richard," I said quietly, almost to myself. "You'll regret underestimating me." His only response was to close the door. The click of the lock echoed in my ears like a gavel slamming down. I stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of humiliation. Then I bent, lifted my suitcase, and turned away from the house I loved. My eyes burned, but somewhere deep inside me, a different fire began to spark. He thought I was weak. He thought I was defeated. But I knew something he didn't seem to remember. The deed. That house was mine, and I was going to take it back. When the taxi pulled away from my street, leaving me standing there with my suitcase and a hollow ache in my chest, I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I didn't just lose a home that day. I lost the man who was supposed to be my partner, my safety, my family. But as I sat alone that night in a small motel room, staring at the ceiling, I repeated one sentence over and over in my head like a prayer. The deed is in my name. The deed is in my name. You see, that house wasn't something Richard and I bought together. It wasn't a marital property we'd scraped and saved for. It was my inheritance. My parents left it to me when they passed, written in clear, inked letters on the official deed. I had kept that paper locked away for years in a fireproof box, along with my parents' old photographs and my birth certificate. Richard knew it, but maybe he thought I was too weak, too broken to remember. Maybe he thought I'd give up and let him and his lover take over, but he underestimated me. The very next morning, I called my lawyer, Mr. Daniels. He had handled my parents' estate years ago, and he was one of the few people I trusted completely. His voice on the phone was calm, steady. "Linda," he said, "you did the right thing calling me. Come to my office. Bring whatever you have, documents, records, anything. We'll set this straight." Walking into his office, I felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. My hand shook as I placed the deed on his desk. He adjusted his glasses, read it carefully, and then looked at me with a reassuring smile. "Linda, this house is yours. Sole ownership. Legally, Richard has no claim to it, not without your consent, and certainly not Elaine." I let out a shaky laugh, part sob, part disbelief. "So I'm not crazy? I'm not finished?" "Far from it," he said firmly. "What he's done, changing the locks, moving someone else in while you were in the hospital, it's not only cruel, it's unlawful. We can reclaim this. But Linda, I want you to prepare yourself. This will be a fight. Richard won't leave quietly." Something inside me straightened at those words. A fight. I had spent weeks in the hospital fighting for my life, gasping for air, praying for strength. I wasn't about to roll over and let Richard and Elaine steal the roof over my head. Mr. Daniels leaned forward. "Do you have any evidence of his affair? Bank statements, photographs, anything showing that he's been moving money or assets?" I thought about the nights in the hospital, the whispered phone calls, the way he smiled at his screen, the fact that Elaine had been wearing my robe. "Not yet," I admitted, "but I can get it." He nodded. "Good. We'll need to show the court not just that the house is yours, but that Richard has acted in bad faith. The more evidence, the stronger your case." I walked out of that office with a folder tucked under my arm and a new resolve hardening inside me. For the first time in weeks, I felt in control. Over the next few days, I began piecing together Richard's betrayal like a puzzle. My illness had slowed me, but it hadn't dulled my mind. I visited the bank to review our accounts. My heart pounded when the teller explained that Richard had attempted to move large sums into a joint account with Elaine's name attached. But here was the beauty of it. I still held the primary authority over those funds. At my request, the accounts were frozen. I imagined the look on Richard's face when he discovered his little scheme had failed. The thought gave me a grim kind of satisfaction. I also started reaching out quietly to a few trusted neighbors. One of them, Mrs. Jenkins, admitted she'd seen Elaine coming and going from the house for weeks while I was still in the hospital. Another whispered that Richard had been boasting in town about finally living free. Every word they shared stoked the fire in my chest. At night, alone in my motel room, I wrote everything down. Dates, names, amounts, overheard conversations. I wasn't going to let grief cloud the details. I wasn't going to give him a single loophole. One evening, as I sat at the desk with papers spread around me, I picked up a photograph of Richard and me on our wedding day. For a long moment, I stared at his younger face. The smile I once believed was genuine. Then, with steady hands, I tore the picture straight down the middle. "This house is mine," I whispered into the silence, "and I will take it back." I didn't know yet how ugly the battle would become. I didn't know how many lies Richard and Elaine would spin to protect their stolen comfort. But I knew this much. The deed didn't lie, and I had the truth on my side. If Richard's betrayal in the hospital and at my own doorstep hadn't been enough, what came next nearly broke me. Elaine didn't just want my husband, she wanted my life, my place, my dignity, and she made sure everyone in town knew it. It started small, snide remarks at the grocery store when I finally worked up the courage to go shopping again. She happened to be there, draped on Richard's arm, her nails clicking against the cart handle as if marking territory. She leaned close to him and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Poor thing, she looks so frail." Honestly, she should be somewhere safer, not clinging to a house she can't handle. Richard chuckled, not even glancing in my direction. He used to smile at me in public, used to slip his arm around my waist. Now he walked right past me, as though I was a ghost haunting the aisles. At church the following Sunday, Elaine took it further. She arrived at Richard's side in a bright red dress, the kind you wear to be noticed. I was sitting 2 pews behind them, my Bible heavy in my lap, my heart pounding. I saw the way the congregation looked, first at them, then at me. Murmurs rippled through the rows. Some looked at me with pity, others with judgment, as if I had failed at keeping my husband. When the service ended, Elaine approached me near the door. Her perfume hit me before her words did, sickly sweet, cloying. She tilted her head, her smile sharp as glass. "Linda, darling," she said, loud enough for nearby ears to catch every syllable, "you really should think about moving into a care facility. Richard worries about you so much, you know. It must be exhausting for him, trying to look after you and the house." I froze, gripping the strap of my handbag so tightly my knuckles went white. "The house is mine," I said quietly but firmly. Her eyes sparkled with mockery. "Oh, sweetheart. Everyone knows Richard is the one taking care of it now. You should let go gracefully." With that, she kissed the air beside my cheek and sauntered away, her heels clicking against the tile, Richard waiting for her with that smug half-smile I used to love. I felt the burn of humiliation crawling up my throat. I wanted to scream, to claw back my pride, but instead, I walked out with my head high. My lawyer's words echoed in my mind. Patience. Every detail matters. Back in my motel room that night, I wept into my pillow. It wasn't just losing Richard. It was the way Elaine was stripping me of my identity piece by piece. She was parading around in my life, mocking me with every step. I pulled out my wedding album, the one I hadn't touched since the day I tore our picture in half. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. Anniversaries, vacations, Christmas mornings, all lies now. One by one, I ripped out Richard's face. The sound of tearing paper was strangely soothing, like each rip was a stitch, mending my wounded heart. By the time I finished, the album was filled with holes, gaps where his smile used to be. I closed it, pressed it to my chest, and whispered, "You won't erase me. Not from this house, not from this life." The following days brought more cruelty. Neighbors reported that Elaine boasted about redecorating her new home, bragging about how she had finally convinced Richard to move on from the past. At the diner, I overheard her telling a friend that I was confused and unstable. She was building a narrative, painting me as a frail old woman clinging to something I no longer deserved. But I knew the truth, and I wasn't about to let her win. One evening, I sat with Mr. Daniels, sliding across the notes I had taken. The dates Elaine had been seen in the house, Richard's attempts at moving funds, the things neighbors had heard. He read through them carefully, nodding. "You're doing exactly what you should, Linda," he said. "Let her mock you. Let her talk. Every word she spreads will only make your case stronger. When the time comes, she'll hang herself with her own rope." That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. The laughter, the whispers, the humiliation, they still stung, but they no longer broke me. Elaine thought she was winning, thought she was driving me into the ground. What she didn't realize was that every cruel remark, every public show, was only sharpening the knife I would one day use to cut her down. I wasn't erased. I was waiting. And when the right moment came, I would rise. Elaine thought her smirks and whispers would break me. Richard thought his cold dismissal would make me disappear. But what they didn't understand was that I had spent weeks in that hospital fighting for my breath. I had learned how to endure pain, how to wait, how to survive. If I could survive that, I could survive them. And I would do more than survive. I would win. My days took on a new rhythm. Instead of waking up to Richard's absence or Elaine's taunts, I woke up with a purpose: to gather every piece of evidence that proved the truth. The house was mine, the inheritance was mine, and no court in the land would hand it over to them. I began with the bank. Walking into the branch where Richard and I had gone together for years, I felt a knot in my stomach. The young teller looked at me politely, not knowing the storm inside me. I requested a review of my accounts, my name firm on the paperwork. When she pulled up the records, my fears were confirmed. Richard had tried to move thousands of dollars into a new account, one that bore both his name and Elaine's. My hand shook as I signed the form to freeze the accounts, but inside I felt a quiet triumph. When the teller stamped the paperwork and handed it back, I imagined Richard storming into the bank, demanding answers, only to be told his access was cut off. The thought warmed me more than any cup of tea could. Next, I focused on the house itself. I went back to the fireproof box where I kept the deed, my parents' will, and every important paper I had guarded for decades. I held the deed in my hands, tracing the letters of my name. It wasn't just ink on a page, it was proof that I belonged, that no matter what Richard said, I was not a guest in that house. I was the owner. I gave copies to Mr. Daniels, who filed them carefully. "This is solid," he told me. "No judge will be able to dispute it. But we're going to build more than just a property claim. We're going to show abandonment, infidelity, financial misconduct. We'll strip him of every ounce of credibility." So I began to collect stories. Quietly, carefully, I spoke with neighbors and friends. Mrs. Jenkins, bless her heart, admitted she had seen Elaine moving boxes into my home while I was still in the hospital. Another neighbor confessed that Richard bragged about finally having freedom at a local bar. A younger woman from church told me Elaine had openly claimed she was the new lady of the house. Each word stung, but each one also strengthened my case. At night, I sat in my motel room with a notebook, writing it all down. Dates, names, quotes. It felt like weaving a net, and Richard and Elaine didn't even realize they were swimming straight into it. One evening, I overheard Elaine at the diner. She was laughing with a friend, saying Richard planned to sell their house in the fall to buy something bigger, something worthy of them. I clenched my jaw, my heart pounding, but I didn't interrupt. I simply wrote it down when I got back to my room. Let her arrogance build my arsenal. Still, it wasn't easy. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, missing the life I thought I had, the man I thought Richard was. But then I'd look at the stack of papers on my desk, bank forms, deed copies, handwritten notes, and I'd remind myself I was not powerless. One afternoon, as I left Mr. Daniels' office, I ran into Richard. He must have heard that the accounts were frozen because his face was red with fury. He stepped in front of me, his voice sharp. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Linda?" he spat. "You can't fight this. You're too weak. You don't have the strength." For a moment, the old fear rose in me. But then I remembered every sleepless night, every mocking word, every paper in my file. I stood tall, meeting his glare. "You called me a burden," I said evenly, "but you're the one who's about to learn what a burden really feels like." His jaw clenched, his hand curled into a fist at his side. But he said nothing. He turned and stalked off, leaving me standing there, my heart racing. That night, I wrote the moment down, adding it to the growing stack. It wasn't just evidence. It was a reminder to myself that I was stronger than his cruelty. Elaine could mock me. Richard could rage. But the truth was on my side, and soon the law would be too. I wasn't just building a case. I was building my return. The day of the hearing arrived with a heavy sky, clouds hanging low as though the world itself was holding its breath. I dressed carefully that morning. Nothing fancy, just a navy blue suit I had kept for special occasions, and a silver brooch that belonged to my mother. I wanted to look dignified, steady, unbroken. I wasn't walking into that courthouse as a victim. I was walking in as the rightful owner of my home. When I stepped into the courtroom, my heart pounded so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. And then I saw them, Richard and Elaine. They sat together at the front, her hand looped through his arm like she was parading him on a leash. She wore a smug smile, a silk scarf tossed over her shoulders, as though she were the star of a play. Richard leaned back, smirking, his eyes locking on mine with something between arrogance and disdain. For a moment, fear threatened to pull me under, but then I saw Mr. Daniels waiting for me, calm and steady, my folder of documents neatly stacked in his hands. He gave me a reassuring nod, and I took my seat. The judge entered, the room settled, and the case began. Richard's lawyer went first, painting a picture of a sickly old woman who could no longer care for herself. He claimed Richard had stepped in to manage the property, that Elaine had been helping because I was unfit. Every word twisted the knife deeper. Elaine sat there nodding, her lips curved in that cruel little smile, as if she already knew victory was hers. When it was my turn, Mr. Daniels stood tall, his voice clear and confident. He began with the deed. He held it up, the judge reviewing every line. My name. Not Richard's, not ours. Mine. Inherited, legally documented, indisputable. I watched Richard's smirk falter for the first time. Elaine shifted in her seat, adjusting her scarf. But Mr. Daniels wasn't finished. He laid out the bank statements, the attempted transfers to Elaine's account, the freeze I had initiated. He presented witness statements from neighbors who had seen Elaine moving into my home while I was still in the hospital. He highlighted the abandonment, that while I fought for my life, Richard was parading his mistress in my robe. The courtroom murmured, whispers echoing off the walls. Richard's face grew red, his jaw tightening. Elaine's smile stiffened, her eyes darting nervously. Then the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Thompson, do you have anything you'd like to say?" I stood slowly, my knees trembling, but my voice steady. I looked at Richard, then at Elaine, and finally at the judge. I was not a burden, I began, my voice carrying more strength than I thought I had left. I was a wife. For 40 years, I cooked, I cleaned, I nursed him through illnesses. I stood by his side through every hardship, and when it was my turn to need care, when I lay in that hospital bed fighting for my life, he called me a burden. He brought another woman into my home, and tried to erase me from my own life. I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I lifted my chin. I may not be as young as I once was. I may not be as strong in body, but I am not weak. I am not confused, and I am certainly not unfit to live in the house my parents entrusted to me. The deed says it. The evidence shows it. But more than that, my heart knows it. This house is mine, and no amount of lies or betrayal will change that. The courtroom was silent when I finished. Even the whispers had stilled. I could hear only the sound of my own heartbeat. The judge cleared his throat. His words came measured, deliberate. The deed leaves no doubt. The house belongs solely to Mrs. Thompson. Furthermore, the evidence of attempted financial misconduct and abandonment is compelling. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of Mrs. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, you and your companion are to vacate the property immediately. Any further interference will be subject to legal consequences. The gavel struck. The sound echoed like thunder. Final and absolute. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Richard's face was pale, his smugness gone, his lips pressed into a thin line of rage. Elaine whispered furiously in his ear, her perfect smile shattered. For the first time in weeks, I felt taller, lighter. Justice wasn't just an idea anymore. It was real, and it was mine. As security moved toward them, Richard shot me one last look, a mixture of fury and disbelief. But I didn't flinch. I met his eyes with calm resolve. I had survived sickness. I had survived betrayal. And now I had survived them. The day I walked back into my house, it was as though the walls themselves sighed in relief. For weeks I had dreamed of this moment, crossing the threshold not as an outcast on my own porch, but as the rightful owner reclaiming what was mine. This time, there was no smirking mistress waiting in my robe, no cruel husband standing in my doorway calling me weak. There was only silence, the kind that comes after a storm. Security had escorted Richard and Elaine out. I hadn't watched them go. I didn't need to. I didn't want their faces burned into my memory any longer. Instead, I stood on the sidewalk, suitcase in hand, as the officers changed the locks back to my control. The sun broke through the clouds at that moment, spilling light across the garden. My roses, though slightly wilted from neglect, were still standing tall. So was I. When the officer handed me the new keys, my fingers trembled as they closed around the metal. That small weight felt heavier than gold, heavier than any jewel. It was proof that I had endured, and I had won. I stepped inside. At first, the smell of someone else's perfume lingered in the air, Elaine's cloying sweetness, which made my stomach turn. Her shoes were gone, her suitcases carried out, but traces of her presence remained. A lipstick-stained glass in the sink, a silk scarf thrown carelessly on a chair. I gathered them up one by one and stuffed them into a garbage bag, my hands steady, my chest rising with a satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. Next came Richard's things, his suits in the closet, his papers on the desk, the framed photographs he had rearranged to erase me. I dragged a box into the living room and began tossing everything in. Each item felt like a chain snapping loose from around my ankles. His slippers, his shaving kit, the tie I bought him for our 20th anniversary, into the box they went. When I sealed it shut, I set it by the door, ready for disposal. I walked through each room slowly, reclaiming it with my presence. The kitchen where I had baked pies for my children, the hallway lined with scuff marks from years of footsteps, the bedroom where I had once prayed for comfort. All of it was mine again. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. In the living room, I paused by the fireplace. There, on the mantel, was the wedding photograph that had gone missing. From my album. Elaine must have taken it out, perhaps to mock me, perhaps to rewrite history in her favor. I stared at it for a long moment. There I was in white lace, young and radiant. There was Richard, beaming as though I were his whole world. My hands didn't tremble when I lifted the frame. I didn't cry. I simply opened the back, pulled the picture out, and tore it neatly in two. I placed my half in the drawer where I kept my keepsakes, and the other half went into the garbage bag. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea. The air was cool, the cicadas buzzing in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. The neighbors waved as they passed, their smiles genuine, their whispers replaced with nods of respect. I had walked through fire, and I had come out not just alive, but stronger. As the stars appeared, I thought about the word Richard had hurled at me like a weapon, burden. For weeks I had carried that word like a stone in my chest, but sitting there on my porch, I realized something. The only burden in my life had been him, the man who drained my spirit, who betrayed my trust, who tried to strip me of my home and dignity. And when I let him go, when the judge's gavel struck and he was cast out, that burden lifted. I wasn't a burden. I was a survivor. I was a woman who had been underestimated, mocked, and betrayed, but who stood her ground and reclaimed everything that mattered. As the night deepened, I whispered to myself, sometimes the heaviest weight you carry is the person who dares to call you one. And when you set that weight down, you finally learn how to fly. And with that, I leaned back in my chair, the keys to my home safe in my pocket, and let myself smile. Not for Richard, not for Elaine, not for anyone else, just for me.